Sarah, 25, came home from her third deployment to find an empty lot where her grandmother's $800,000 Victorian house used to stand. Her parents had sold everything, spent the money on themselves, and thought she'd never find out. They were wrong. When I stepped off that military transport, I was expecting to finally relax in the home my grandmother left me. Instead, I found strangers living in a brand new house built on my property. My parents looked me straight in the eye and said the old house had to be torn down for safety reasons. But when I dug deeper, I discovered they'd pocketed over $1 million from selling my inheritance. They bought themselves a luxury condo, new cars, and expensive vacations while I was dodging bullets overseas. They thought I was just a naive soldier who'd never questioned them. They had no idea I was about to wage the most important battle of my life. 3 months before my first deployment, my grandmother Helen called me into her garden. She was 87 then, still sharp as a tack, but her hands shook as she held mine. "Sarah, sweetheart, I need to tell you something important," she said, her voice carrying that serious tone I remembered from childhood lectures. The afternoon sun filtered through her prized rose bushes, casting dancing shadows across her weathered face. "This house is going to be yours when I'm gone," she continued, gesturing toward the magnificent 3-story Victorian behind us. "Not your parents', not your brother Danny. Yours." I tried to protest, but she held up her hand. "I've watched you grow up in these rooms, child. You're the one who helped me tend this garden every summer. You're the one who listened to my stories about your great-grandfather building this place with his own hands in 1924. This house chose you long before I made it official." The house was genuinely spectacular. Painted ladies, they called these San Francisco-style Victorians, with their elaborate woodwork and vibrant colors. Grandma Helen's was mint green with cream trim, featuring intricate gingerbread details that great-grandfather had carved himself. Inside, 12-foot ceilings soared above original hardwood floors that creaked in all the familiar places. The kitchen still had the 1950s checkered linoleum that Grandma refused to replace because it reminded her of better times. Every room held memories. The window seat where I'd read Nancy Drew mysteries, the dining room where we'd played endless games of Scrabble, the attic filled with trunks of family photographs and heirlooms. But it wasn't just the house that made my inheritance valuable. Grandma Helen had been collecting antiques for 60 years. Original Tiffany lamps illuminated rooms filled with authentic Victorian furniture, Persian rugs, and china sets that belonged to her mother. The basement workshop housed great-grandfather's tool collection, some pieces dating back to the 1800s and worth thousands to collectors. Every closet revealed new treasures: first edition books, vintage jewelry, silver sets that had survived the Great Depression. When Grandma passed 6 months later, I was already in basic training. The funeral was a blur of dress uniforms and suppressed tears. My parents, Linda and Robert, seemed genuinely grief-stricken, which surprised me given their historically complicated relationship with Grandma. "Don't worry about the house, honey," Mom assured me at the cemetery. "Dad and I will take care of everything until you get back from overseas. We'll maintain it, keep it safe, make sure nothing happens to Grandma's things." Their offer seemed like a blessing. Military housing was cramped and temporary, and I couldn't bear the thought of my grandmother's beautiful home sitting empty and neglected. "We'll even handle the property taxes and insurance," Dad added, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "You just focus on serving our country and staying safe. When you come home, everything will be exactly as Grandma left it." I should have been suspicious of their sudden helpfulness. Growing up, my parents had always complained about Grandma's stubborn independence and her wasteful spending on antiques. They'd made snide comments about the house being too much work and money pit. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and I wanted to believe they were finally honoring Grandma's memory. The last time I saw the house, I stood on the front porch in my dress blues, keys heavy in my hand. The morning sun caught the stained glass transom above the door, casting rainbows across the vintage mailbox that still read Helen Morrison in fading gold letters. I promised myself I'd change it to Sarah Morrison when I returned. I had no idea I'd never get the chance. Afghanistan wasn't what the recruitment videos had prepared me for. The heat was suffocating, the dust got into everything, and the constant threat of IEDs made every convoy feel like Russian roulette. But through it all, thoughts of Grandma's house kept me grounded. During the longest nights on guard duty, I'd mentally walk through every room, remembering the smell of her lavender sachets and the way afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains. My parents were surprisingly good about staying in touch. Every few weeks, Mom would send care packages filled with homemade cookies and photos of progress on the house. "We're having the roof inspected," one letter read, accompanied by pictures of contractors on ladders. "Found some loose shingles that needed replacing. Thank goodness we caught it before the winter rains." The photos showed professional-looking workers, and I felt grateful that my parents were taking such good care of my inheritance. Dad's emails were equally reassuring. "Had to get the plumbing updated in the guest bathroom," he wrote during my second deployment. "Old pipes were starting to leak. Better to fix it now than deal with water damage later." He attached invoices from Martinez Plumbing, everything looking legitimate and necessary. "Don't worry about the costs, kiddo. We're handling everything with the rental income from the basement apartment." I hadn't known about any rental income, but it made sense. The basement had its own entrance and could easily be converted into a studio apartment. "How much are you getting for rent?" I'd asked in my next email. "About $200 a month," Dad replied. "Nice young couple, both teachers. They love the neighborhood and take great care of the space." Between deployments, during my brief leave periods, I'd wanted to visit the house, but my parents always had reasonable excuses. "We're right in the middle of having the hardwood floors refinished," Mom explained during one phone call. "The whole place smells like polyurethane and it's not safe to breathe. Why don't you spend your leave with us at our place instead?" Their apartment was cramped, but I appreciated their concern for my health. The photos they sent throughout those 3 years told a story of careful maintenance and gradual improvements. New gutters, fresh paint on the exterior trim, updated electrical work in the kitchen. "The inspector said the old wiring was from the 1960s, Dad explained. "Fire hazard waiting to happen. We're bringing everything up to code." Each project made perfect sense, and I admired their dedication to preserving Grandma's legacy. During my final deployment, the emails became less frequent, but when they did arrive, they carried good news. "Finally got the foundation work finished," Mom wrote. "There was some settling that needed to be addressed. You know how these old houses are?" The attached photo showed what looked like concrete repair work around the basement. "The structural engineer says it's solid as a rock now." My buddies in the unit got tired of hearing me talk about the house. "Morrison's always going on about her grandmother's mansion," they'd joke during chow time. But I didn't care. That house represented everything I was fighting for. Family, heritage, stability, a future where I could build something lasting. When rockets hit our forward operating base, when we lost friends to roadside bombs, when the heat and exhaustion made everything feel hopeless, I'd close my eyes and picture myself sitting in Grandma's garden, reading a book in the shade of her apple tree. "Can't wait to see what you've done with the place," I wrote to my parents 2 weeks before my final departure. "The house is going to be perfect," Mom replied. She wasn't wrong, but not in the way I expected. The taxi ride from the airport should have been triumphant. After 3 years overseas, I was finally coming home to my inheritance, ready to start the next chapter of my life. I'd saved nearly every penny of my military pay, planning renovations and dreaming of hosting family gatherings in Grandma's dining room. The driver, a chatty guy named Miguel, asked about my service, and I found myself telling him about the Victorian house I was about to see for the first time as its owner. "Those old Victorians are beautiful," he said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "My grandmother lived in one in the Mission District. They don't make them like that anymore." I agreed, my excitement building as we turned onto Elm Street. I'd memorized this route as a child, counting the blocks until we reached Grandma's corner lot with its towering oak trees and white picket fence. But when we pulled up to 1247 Elm Street, my world collapsed. Where Grandma's 3-story Victorian should have stood, there was nothing but an empty lot with construction equipment scattered across bare dirt. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, and a sign read, "Future Home of Sunset Grove Luxury Condominiums." I sat in the taxi, staring at the vacant space, trying to convince myself we had the wrong address. "This can't be right," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the taxi's idling engine. Miguel looked concerned as I fumbled with my phone, checking the GPS coordinates I'd saved years ago. The numbers matched perfectly. "Driver, are you sure this is 1247 Elm Street?" He nodded, pointing to the number painted on the curb. I paid him with shaking hands and stood on the sidewalk, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The oak trees were gone. The garden where Grandma and I had planted roses was now a pile of rubble. Even the original stone steps that had led to the front porch had been demolished. I walked to the construction trailer parked on the corner of the lot, hoping someone could explain what had happened. A hard hat-wearing supervisor emerged as I approached. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice cracking. "I'm looking for information about the house that used to be here." The supervisor, whose name tag read Jim, looked me up and down, taking in my military uniform and obvious distress. "Oh, you must be asking about the Morrison place," he said sympathetically. "Beautiful old house, real shame they had to tear it down. But the foundation was completely shot, and there was some kind of toxic mold situation. Family had no choice but to demolish." Toxic mold? Foundation problems? None of this matched the emails my parents had sent me about routine maintenance and improvements. "When was it torn down?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Jim consulted his tablet. "Demo started about 8 months ago. Took 3 weeks to clear everything. The family was real broken up about it, especially the older couple. They kept saying their daughter was going to be heartbroken." 8 months ago, my parents were still sending me photos of progress on the house. 8 months ago, Mom had written about the foundation being solid as a rock. I thanked Jim and stumbled back to the sidewalk, my mind racing. Either my parents had been lying to me for months or there had been some terrible misunderstanding. I pulled out my phone and called Mom's number. "Sarah, honey, you're home." Her voice sounded strained, artificially cheerful. "Where are you? We're so excited to see you." I stood there looking at the empty lot, construction dust swirling around my boots. "Mom, I'm standing where Grandma's house used to be. There's nothing here but dirt and construction equipment. What happened to my house?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted forever. Finally, Mom's voice came through, smaller now, defensive. "Oh, sweetie, we were going to explain everything when you got home. It's complicated, but we did what we had to do. We saved you from a disaster." My parents' apartment felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closing in as I sat at their kitchen table, still in my travel clothes, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of the empty lot I'd just witnessed. Mom bustled around making coffee with nervous energy while Dad sat across from me, his face grave and artificially sympathetic. The familiar smell of Mom's vanilla candles couldn't mask the tension in the air. "The house was in worse shape than we realized," Dad began, spreading manila folders across the table like he was presenting a business proposal. "Once we started doing serious inspections, the problems just kept multiplying." He opened the first folder, revealing what looked like official estimates and reports. The foundation had major structural damage, cracks running through the basement walls, water damage, the whole 9 yards. Mom set down coffee cups and joined us, her hands fluttering nervously. "The mold situation was absolutely terrible, Sarah. Black mold throughout the walls, especially in the basement where that young couple had been renting. We had to get them out immediately for their health." She pulled out photographs showing dark stains on walls and what appeared to be professional mold remediation equipment. The environmental inspector said it would cost more to fix than the house was worth. I studied the documents, my military training kicking in as I looked for inconsistencies. The letterhead on the structural engineer's report looked professional, complete with official seals and technical language about compromised load-bearing elements and imminent safety hazards. The mold remediation estimate came from a company called Pacific Environmental Solutions, totaling $185,000 for complete remediation. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "Why didn't you get a second opinion before tearing down my inheritance?" Dad reached across the table, his expression pained. "Honey, we tried to handle this without burdening you. You were in a war zone, dealing with life and death situations. The last thing you needed was to worry about a crumbling house back home." Mom nodded vigorously. "The city condemned the property, Sarah. We had 30 days to either fix everything or demolish it. There was no time to get multiple opinions, no time for lengthy phone calls to Afghanistan. We made the hard choice to protect you from financial ruin. She pulled out another folder, this one containing what looked like official city notices with impressive stamps and signatures. So what happened to everything? I pressed. Grandma's antiques, her furniture, all the family heirlooms? My parents exchanged a glance that lasted just a fraction too long. We salvaged what we could, Dad said quietly, but most of it had water damage or mold contamination. The antique furniture was rotted through, the Persian rugs were destroyed, even the china had to be thrown away for safety reasons. Mom's eyes welled up with tears. It broke our hearts, sweetie. Watching your grandmother's beautiful things go into the dumpster was one of the hardest things we've ever had to do, but we couldn't risk exposing anyone to toxic mold spores. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue. We saved the few pieces that were salvageable. They're in our storage unit downtown. What about the insurance? I asked, grasping for something positive in this nightmare. Surely homeowners insurance covered some of this? Dad shook his head sadly. The policy had lapsed, honey. Your grandmother had been behind on payments before she passed, and with all the confusion after the funeral, it slipped through the cracks. We didn't realize until it was too late. I sat there, absorbing this information, feeling like I was drowning in a sea of reasonable explanations and sympathetic faces. Every question I asked had a plausible answer. Every concern was met with documentation and parental concern. But something felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, the explanations too neat, and my parents seemed almost rehearsed in their responses. I need some air, I said, standing up abruptly. This is a lot to process. Mom reached for my arm. Of course, darling, take all the time you need. We're just glad you're home safe. But as I walked out into the afternoon sun, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If the house was such a disaster, why hadn't the construction supervisor mentioned any of these problems? The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse with a sick feeling in my stomach. Jim, the construction supervisor's casual mention of a real shame demolition didn't match my parents' story about city condemnation and toxic mold. Something was wrong, and I needed official records to prove it. The clerk at the property records office was a middle-aged woman named Patricia who took one look at my military uniform and offered to help personally. I'm looking for information about 1247 Elm Street, I explained, sliding my ID across the counter. The property was demolished about 8 months ago, and I need to understand why. Patricia typed into her computer, her expression growing curious as she scrolled through the records. That's interesting, she murmured. There's no condemnation order on file for this property. No city violations, no environmental hazards reported. My heart started pounding. What about the sale records? Patricia clicked through several screens, then printed out a stack of documents. The property sold 9 months ago for $850,000 cash to Sunset Grove Development. The sellers were Linda and Robert Morrison. She handed me the papers with a sympathetic look. I'm guessing those are your parents? I stared at the documents, my hands shaking. The sale date was 2 weeks after my parents had sent me photos of roof repairs. The buyer was a legitimate development company, and there was no mention of structural problems, mold, or emergency demolition. Is there a record of what happened to the contents? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Patricia pulled up another screen. There was a separate transaction through Hartwell Estate Sales. Personal property auction totaled $247,000. She printed that record too. Looks like it was a complete estate liquidation. Antiques, furniture, jewelry, artwork, everything. Over $1 million. My parents had liquidated my entire inheritance and pocketed every penny while telling me heartbreaking stories about water damage and toxic mold. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically nauseated. Can I get copies of all these records? I asked weakly. Patricia nodded, already reaching for the copy machine. Honey, I've seen a lot of family disputes over property, but this looks like outright theft. You might want to talk to a lawyer. As I walked out of the courthouse with a manila envelope full of evidence, I realized my parents hadn't just stolen my house. They'd stolen 3 years of my life, filling my deployments with lies while they systematically dismantled everything my grandmother had left me. The war I'd thought I'd finished overseas was just beginning. I drove straight to my parents' new address, which I'd found in the property records. Instead of their cramped apartment, they now lived in a luxury condo complex called Harbor View Towers. The building had a doorman, valet parking, and views of the bay that cost serious money. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I realized they'd used my inheritance to upgrade their entire lifestyle. Mom answered the door in a silk blouse I'd never seen before, her smile faltering when she saw my face. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise. We weren't expecting you until dinner." Behind her, I could see new furniture, expensive artwork, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Dad emerged from what appeared to be a home office, quickly closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past them into their living room. I dumped the courthouse records onto their glass coffee table. "I know what you did. I know everything." The color drained from both their faces as they stared at the property sale documents and estate auction receipts. Dad recovered first, his expression shifting from shock to defensive anger. "Now, Sarah, before you jump to conclusions, let us explain." But I was done listening to explanations. "You sold my house for $850,000 and auctioned Grandma's antiques for another $250,000. You've been lying to me for months while I was dodging bullets overseas." Mom sank into their new leather sofa, tears starting to flow. "We were going to tell you eventually, honey. We just wanted to wait until you were settled back home." Her voice cracked with what seemed like genuine emotion, but I was beyond caring about their feelings. "Tell me what, Mom? That you're thieves? That you stole everything Grandma left me?" "We didn't steal anything," Dad exploded, his face reddening. "Do you have any idea what we sacrificed raising you? 25 years of our lives, putting you through school, supporting your dreams. Your grandmother never gave us anything, never helped us when we were struggling. She leaves everything to you when you're barely an adult, and we're supposed to just maintain it like unpaid caretakers?" His words hit like a slap. "So you think you deserved my inheritance?" Dad straightened up, his voice cold now. "We deserved something after everything we've done for you. And frankly, Sarah, you're being ungrateful. We saved you from the burden of that old house and invested your money wisely in our future security." I looked around their luxury condo, at the life they'd built with my stolen inheritance, and felt something break inside me. "Get ready for a fight," I said quietly, "because I'm taking you to court, and I'm going to destroy you." The law office of Martinez and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Elena Martinez was a sharp-eyed attorney in her 50s who specialized in inheritance disputes and elder abuse cases. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally taking notes as I laid out the evidence I'd gathered from the courthouse. "This is a clear case of breach of fiduciary duty," she said after reviewing the property records. "Your parents had power of attorney, which legally required them to act in your best interests, not their own. The fact that they lied about the circumstances while enriching themselves makes this potentially criminal fraud." She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "But I need you to understand what you're getting into. Family litigation is expensive, emotionally brutal, and there's no guarantee we'll recover everything." I thought about my parents' smug faces, Dad's speech about deserving my inheritance, their luxury condo bought with Grandma's antiques. What are my chances of winning? Elena pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out the case strategy. Strong, but not guaranteed. We'll need to prove they violated their fiduciary duty, which shouldn't be difficult given the evidence. The challenge will be recovering assets they've already spent and convincing a jury that this wasn't just a family misunderstanding. She quoted her retainer fee, a number that made me wince. Between legal costs and expert witnesses, this lawsuit would consume most of my military savings. "There is one other consideration," Elena added carefully. "Your parents will likely claim you're suffering from PTSD or other combat-related mental health issues. They'll paint themselves as protective parents who made difficult decisions for an unstable veteran." The suggestion made my blood boil, but I recognized the tactical wisdom. "They're already setting that narrative," I admitted, remembering their comments about not wanting to burden me during deployment. Elena nodded grimly. We'll need medical evaluations proving your mental competency, character witnesses, and documentation of your responsible financial behavior. This won't just be about property law, it'll be about proving you're capable of managing your own affairs. I signed the retainer agreement with a steady hand, emptying my savings account to fund the fight for my stolen inheritance. One more thing, Elena said as I prepared to leave. Family members often try to settle these cases quietly to avoid public embarrassment. Don't let them convince you to accept less than full restitution. They're counting on your guilt and family loyalty to protect them from consequences. I thought about Grandma's empty lot and their luxury lifestyle built on lies. They miscalculated, I said. I'm not the same person who left for Afghanistan. Building a case against my own parents felt surreal, but Elena's investigation strategy was methodical and thorough. We started with the neighbors who had lived near Grandma's house, hoping to find witnesses who could contradict my parents' claims about structural damage and mold problems. Mrs. Chen, who lived directly across the street, invited me into her kitchen and poured tea while I explained the situation. Your parents told everyone the house was falling apart, she said, shaking her head sadly. But I watched that property for 60 years, and it was in beautiful condition right up until the demolition crew arrived. No mold remediation trucks, no structural engineers, nothing like what they described. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos she'd taken of the demolition. I was so upset watching them tear down such a beautiful piece of history. Your grandmother would have been heartbroken. The estate sale company provided another crucial piece of evidence. Hartwell Estate Sales had detailed inventory records of everything they'd auctioned from the house. Their appraiser, David Hartwell, met me at his warehouse surrounded by photographs of Grandma's belongings. This was one of the finest collections I've handled in 30 years, he said, flipping through pictures of the Tiffany lamps and Victorian furniture. Everything was in pristine condition, no water damage, no mold, no structural issues that would affect the contents. He showed me the final auction catalog, complete with professional photographs and condition reports. Your parents were very specific about wanting everything sold quickly and quietly. They didn't want a public auction, insisted on private sales to dealers. That usually means people are trying to avoid attention. The total proceeds were even higher than the court records showed, $278,000 for antiques that my parents had claimed were destroyed by water damage and contamination. Elena's private investigator uncovered the most damning evidence. Pacific Environmental Solutions, the company that had supposedly provided the mold remediation estimate, didn't exist. The business license was fake, the address was a vacant lot, and the phone number was disconnected. Your parents created an entire fictional company to justify their actions, Elena explained during our strategy meeting. This moves beyond simple breach of fiduciary duty into criminal fraud territory. But my parents weren't passive targets. Elena's office received a call from their new attorney, threatening harassment charges if we continued stalking them by interviewing neighbors. They'd hired Blackstone and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in the city. They're scared, Elena observed. People don't spend this kind of money on legal representation unless they know they're in serious trouble. The war was escalating, and both sides were digging in for a prolonged battle. My parents' counteroffensive began with a restraining order filed on a Friday afternoon designed to catch us off guard before the weekend. The papers were served to me at my apartment by a sheriff's deputy who looked embarrassed about the whole situation. According to the court filing, I was supposedly harassing and intimidating my parents through aggressive behavior and threats of violence. The order prohibited me from coming within 500 feet of their home or workplace. This is a classic intimidation tactic, Elena explained when I called her in a panic. They're trying to make you look unstable and vindictive. We'll fight it, but they've bought themselves a few weeks of breathing room. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following month, giving my parents time to construct their narrative of a mentally unstable veteran daughter who couldn't accept their reasonable decisions. Their strategy became clear when Elena received discovery documents from Blackstone and Associates. My parents were claiming that the house sale was a medical intervention necessitated by my erratic behavior and financial irresponsibility during my military service. They'd somehow obtained copies of my medical records, including therapy sessions I'd attended for combat stress. Their attorney was arguing that power of attorney gave them the right to make protective decisions for a daughter suffering from PTSD. The character assassination extended beyond the courtroom. My extended family started calling with concerned questions about my mental health crisis. Aunt Margaret, Grandma's younger sister, left a voicemail saying she was worried about the stress I was putting myself under with this unnecessary lawsuit. Cousin Danny, who I'd grown up with, sent a text saying he was disappointed in my attack on family unity. My parents had clearly been working the phones, spreading their version of events throughout our extended family. According to their narrative, they were loving parents who'd made a difficult decision to protect their unstable daughter from financial ruin, and I was an ungrateful veteran who'd returned from war with serious mental health problems. The fact that they'd used my inheritance to buy themselves a luxury lifestyle was conveniently omitted from their sob story. The psychological warfare was working. I found myself second-guessing my memories, wondering if I really was being unreasonable. Maybe the house had been in worse shape than I remembered. Maybe my combat experience had affected my judgment. Elena had warned me about this phenomenon, calling it litigation gaslighting, but knowing the tactic didn't make it any less effective. "They're counting on you to break down and give up," she reminded me during a particularly difficult week. Every family theft case I've handled involves this same psychological manipulation. Stay focused on the facts, not their emotions. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Judge Patricia Walsh presided from her bench with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd heard every family dispute imaginable. My parents sat at the defendant's table with their attorney, Thomas Blackstone, a silver-haired man whose expensive suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. They both looked older than I remembered, more fragile, like victims rather than thieves. Elena's opening statement was precise and devastating. She walked the jury through the timeline of deception, highlighting each lie my parents had told while systematically looting my inheritance. "The defendants didn't just betray their daughter's trust," she said, pointing to the evidence tables covered with forged documents and fake invoices. "They created an elaborate fiction to justify stealing over $1 million from a deployed soldier who was serving her country overseas." Blackstone's response was equally calculated, but focused entirely on emotion rather than facts. He painted my parents as heartbroken caregivers who'd watched me struggle with combat trauma and made impossible decisions to protect my future. "Sarah Morrison returned from war a changed person," he told the jury, his voice heavy with sympathy. Her parents saw the signs of PTSD, the financial irresponsibility, the inability to make sound decisions. They chose to preserve her inheritance rather than watch her destroy it. My testimony was the emotional centerpiece of our case. Elena guided me through my relationship with Grandma, the condition of the house when I'd left for deployment, and the systematic lies my parents had told me over 3 years. When I described returning home to find an empty lot where my childhood memories should have been, several jurors looked genuinely moved. But Blackstone's cross-examination was brutal. He forced me to admit I'd never actually inspected the house's foundation personally, that I'd been receiving psychiatric treatment for combat stress, that I'd had adjustment difficulties returning to civilian life. He made every normal response to war trauma sound like evidence of mental instability. "Isn't it possible, Miss Morrison, that your parents saw problems you couldn't see, that your judgment was impaired by your military experiences?" My parents' testimony was masterfully crafted theater. Mom cried actual tears, describing her heartbreak at having to sell the house, claiming they'd hoped to surprise me with a more suitable property purchase when I returned. Dad presented himself as the reluctant decision-maker, forced to act quickly when the city condemned the property. Their story was still full of holes, but delivered with such apparent sincerity that I could see some jurors wavering. The trial was becoming exactly what Elena had warned me about, a battle between competing narratives rather than a simple presentation of facts. 3 weeks into the trial, I was losing hope. The jury seemed sympathetic to my parents' portrayal of themselves as concerned caregivers making tough decisions for their troubled daughter. Blackstone had masterfully turned my military service against me, making every moment of combat stress sound like evidence of incompetence. Elena remained confident, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes during our evening strategy sessions. The medical expert witness had testified that PTSD could indeed affect judgment, and several jurors had nodded sympathetically when my parents described their impossible position of having to make decisions for their unstable daughter. The previous night had been particularly brutal. Elena and I had stayed up until 2 a.m. reviewing testimony transcripts, looking for any inconsistency we might have missed. "Their story is falling apart, but slowly," she'd said, rubbing her tired eyes. "We need something definitive, something that completely destroys their credibility. Without it, this could go either way." That's when she got the call that changed everything. Elena's phone rang during our lunch break on a Thursday, and I watched her face transform from exhaustion to excitement as she listened to the caller. Her posture straightened, her eyes widened, and she began scribbling notes frantically on her legal pad. "We'll be right there," she said, hanging up and grabbing her briefcase. "Sarah, we need to get to First National Bank immediately. Helen's attorney just found something that's going to blow this case wide open." Margaret Hoffman had been Grandma's lawyer for 40 years, a sharp woman in her 70s who'd been quietly investigating something that had bothered her since the trial began. She'd known Helen Morrison better than anyone, and something about my parents' testimony didn't ring true. "Your grandmother was paranoid about many things in her final years," Margaret had told Elena during their first meeting, "but she was never paranoid about money without good reason." We met her at the bank where she led us to the safety deposit box section, past the armed guard and through multiple security doors. "Your grandmother was much cleverer than anyone realized," Margaret said, producing a key I'd never seen before from her vintage leather handbag. "She came to me 6 months before she died, worried about your parents' financial desperation and their increasing pressure on her to help them out. She'd been receiving phone calls from creditors looking for your father, and she'd overheard conversations between your parents about what they called the fairness problem with her will." The bank manager, a distinguished man in his 60s, personally escorted us to box 1247, the same number as Grandma's house address. "Mrs. Morrison was very specific about this box," he explained as he inserted his master key alongside Margaret's. "She said it contained insurance for Sarah's future and left strict instructions about when it could be opened." Inside the safety deposit box was a manila envelope marked "For Sarah's protection" in Grandma's careful handwriting, along with several other documents I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing papers that made my heart race. The first was a second will, dated 2 weeks after the one my parents had probated, explicitly revoking power of attorney and naming Margaret as the executor if anything happened to the original inheritance. But the real bombshell was underneath, a life insurance policy for $2 million with a very specific clause. "Your grandmother bought this policy specifically to protect against family theft," Margaret explained, her voice filled with admiration for her late client's foresight. "She'd been watching your parents' mounting debts, their complaints about not being included in her will, their subtle hints about deserving compensation for all they'd done. She even hired a private investigator to document their financial situation without their knowledge." The insurance policy was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of a standard death benefit, it was designed as theft protection insurance issued by Sentinel Family Trust Protection, a specialized company that dealt exclusively with inheritance fraud cases. If anyone with power of attorney sold Helen Morrison's property without the explicit written consent of the primary beneficiary, Sarah Morrison, the policy would pay out double the assessed value of all stolen assets. The insurance company had been investigating the claim since Margaret filed it 3 months ago, and their findings were documented in a thick folder. "But here's the truly brilliant part," Margaret continued, pulling out another document and a small digital recorder. "Your grandmother recorded a video deposition 6 months before she died, detailing her concerns about your parents and her decision to create this protection policy. She wanted to ensure that if her worst fears came true, there would be undeniable evidence of her true intentions. She also had me document every conversation she had with your parents about money, every request they made, every pressure tactic they used. Elena was practically vibrating with excitement as she read through the policy documents and investigation reports. This doesn't just prove your case, Sarah. This destroys their entire defense. They can't claim they were protecting you when your grandmother specifically created a $2 million insurance policy to protect you from them. She started making notes frantically. We need to get this evidence admitted immediately. This changes everything. I stared at the documents, overwhelmed by my grandmother's wisdom and love. Even from beyond the grave, she was still protecting me, still fighting for the inheritance she'd wanted me to have. The investigation folder contained photographs of my parents meeting with real estate agents, copies of loan applications they'd filed using the house as collateral, and recorded phone conversations where they discussed getting what we deserve from Helen's estate. She knew they would do this, I whispered, tears blurring my vision. She knew exactly who they were and she planned for it. Margaret nodded sadly. Helen loved your parents, but she wasn't blind to their faults. She used to tell me that people show you who they really are when money is involved. She wanted to believe they'd honor her wishes, but she prepared for the worst. She squeezed my hand gently. Your grandmother would be so proud of how you fought for what's rightfully yours. She always said you had more backbone than the rest of the family combined. As we walked back to the courthouse with our game-changing evidence, I realized that Grandma Helen had fought one last battle for me, and she was about to win it posthumously. The courtroom atmosphere shifted the moment Elena stood up the next morning with a motion to admit new evidence. Judge Walsh reviewed the insurance documents with growing interest while Blackstone frantically objected, claiming the evidence was inflammatory and prejudicial. His confident demeanor from the previous weeks had evaporated, replaced by the desperate scrambling of a lawyer who knew his case was about to implode. Your Honor, this alleged evidence was deliberately concealed from discovery and should be excluded as a matter of legal procedure, he argued, his voice strained. But the legal facts were undeniable. The insurance policy was legitimate, properly executed, and directly relevant to the case at hand. Elena had spent all night preparing her argument, consulting with legal precedents and insurance law specialists. Your Honor, she countered, this evidence doesn't just prove that the defendants committed fraud, it proves that the deceased specifically anticipated their actions and took legal steps to protect her granddaughter from exactly the theft that occurred. She held up the video deposition, still sealed in its envelope. Helen Morrison's own words will demonstrate that this wasn't a family misunderstanding, but a premeditated crime she saw coming months before her death. Judge Walsh agreed to review the evidence in chambers, and after a 2-hour recess, she returned with a grim expression. The court finds this evidence highly relevant and admissible. The jury will view Mrs. Morrison's video deposition after lunch and will hear testimony from the insurance company representatives. When the jury watched Grandma's video testimony, you could hear a pin drop. The courtroom's usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations fell silent as my grandmother appeared on the large monitor that had been wheeled in for the occasion. There she was in Margaret's office, looking frail but determined, speaking directly into the camera with the clarity I remembered from our garden conversations. She wore the blue cardigan I'd given her for Christmas 2 years before her death, and her hands were folded in her lap with the same composure she'd maintained through decades of family challenges. If you're watching this video, it means my fears about Linda and Robert have come true, she said, her voice steady despite her obvious illness. I love my son and daughter-in-law, but I've watched them struggle with money for years, and I've seen how they look at my house, my antiques, my savings. I've heard their conversations when they think I'm sleeping or not paying attention. She detailed specific conversations where my parents had pressured her to change her will, their complaints about my inheritance being unfair, and their increasingly desperate financial situation. The video included timestamps and dates, showing how systematically she documented their behavior. They think Sarah is too young to handle an inheritance, but that's not their decision to make. This house has been in our family for a century, and it belongs to the granddaughter who helped me tend its garden and listen to its stories. If they've sold my home and stolen Sarah's inheritance, I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Several jurors wiped their eyes as Grandma concluded her testimony. Sarah doesn't know about this insurance policy or this video. I'm hoping she'll never need to see it. But if she does, I want her to know that her grandmother fought for her even after death, because that's what love really means, protecting the people you care about, even from your own family when necessary. The insurance adjuster took the stand that afternoon, a professional woman named Dr. Patricia Evans, who specialized in inheritance fraud investigations. She explained how they'd investigated the claim and determined that my parents had indeed committed insurance fraud by misrepresenting the circumstances of the property sale. The policy was specifically designed to trigger in case of theft by power of attorney holders, she testified, consulting her detailed investigation report. Mrs. Morrison was very clear about her concerns and wanted maximum protection for her granddaughter. She even paid higher premiums for extended coverage that included criminal prosecution support. Dr. Evans revealed that the insurance company had been monitoring the situation since before Grandma's death, as per the policy terms. They had documentation of every transaction, every lie my parents had told, and every dollar they'd spent from my stolen inheritance. The defendants not only stole the inheritance, she testified, but they actively worked to cover up their crimes by creating false documentation and spreading misinformation about their daughter's mental state. My parents' defense completely crumbled. Blackstone tried to argue that they'd been unaware of the second will or the insurance policy, but Margaret's testimony revealed that my father had actually called her office multiple times asking about any other legal documents Helen might have left. Phone records showed 17 separate calls to Margaret's office in the weeks following Grandma's death, each time asking increasingly specific questions about additional assets or legal protections. The financial forensics expert Elena had hired delivered the final blow. Dr. Michael Torres had traced every dollar of my stolen inheritance through bank records, credit card statements, and purchase agreements. Using charts and graphs that made the theft impossible to ignore, he showed how my parents had purchased their luxury condo, new cars, expensive vacations, jewelry, artwork, and even invested some of the money in stocks. The defendants didn't just steal the inheritance, he testified. They built their entire current lifestyle on the proceeds of that theft, then continued spending as if the money would never run out. The evidence showed they'd spent nearly $400,000 beyond the actual theft, financing additional purchases against their stolen assets. They'd been planning to sell the condo and disappear to a non-extradition country when the lawsuit was filed, with airplane tickets to Costa Rica found in Dad's desk drawer. When the jury returned after only 4 hours of deliberation, their verdict was swift and decisive. The foreman, a middle-aged veteran himself, read the verdict with visible emotion, guilty on all counts of breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The evidence had been so overwhelming that they'd barely needed to deliberate. Judge Walsh's sentencing was equally decisive. She ordered full restitution of the original inheritance plus penalties totaling $1.8 million. But thanks to Grandma's insurance policy, I was also awarded the full $2 million payout for theft protection. Additionally, the court ordered them to pay all legal costs, investigative fees, and punitive damages. In my 30 years on the bench, Judge Walsh said during sentencing, her voice carrying the weight of genuine disgust, I've rarely seen such a calculated betrayal of family trust. The defendants systematically lied to their daughter while she served our country overseas, stealing not just her inheritance but her childhood memories and family legacy. They showed no remorse, no accountability, and no respect for the sacrifices their daughter made in military service. She sentenced them each to 3 years in prison and ordered them to pay all legal costs. As my parents were led away in handcuffs, Mom turned back to look at me one last time. The woman who'd raised me, who'd packed care packages for my deployments, who'd held me when I'd scraped my knees as a child, was now a stranger facing prison time for stealing from her own daughter. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a deep sadness for what our family had lost forever. But Grandma Helen had won her final battle, and justice had finally been served. 1 year later, I stood in the garden where Grandma Helen and I had planted roses together, watching the sun set over the rebuilt Victorian house at 1247 Elm Street. The insurance money and court settlement had allowed me to buy back the lot from Sunset Grove Development and hire the best restoration architects in the city. The development company, faced with the legal complications of purchasing stolen property, had sold the lot back to me for exactly what they'd paid my parents, absorbing their own construction losses as the cost of due diligence they should have performed. Using Grandma's old photographs, my childhood memories, and even some original architectural plans we'd found in the city archives, we'd recreated every detail of the original house, from the mint green paint with cream trim to the intricate gingerbread woodwork that great-grandfather had carved by hand. The rebuilding process had taken 8 months and cost nearly $1.2 million, but every penny was worth it. The house wasn't just rebuilt, it was reborn, stronger and more beautiful than the original. The rebuild had been therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Every decision, from choosing the period-appropriate doorknobs to matching the original hardwood floors, felt like a conversation with Grandma's memory. The contractors, led by a master craftsman named Roberto who specialized in Victorian restorations, treated the project like a sacred mission. "Your grandmother's spirit is guiding this work," he told me one afternoon as we installed the replica stained glass transom above the front door. "Houses like this deserve to be brought back to life, and you can feel her presence approving every choice we make." Roberto's team had become like family during the construction. They'd listened to my stories about Grandma, studied her photographs with reverence, and even tracked down the original paint manufacturer to get exact color matches. When we discovered that great-grandfather's original workshop blueprints were still on file at the city planning office, they'd rebuilt the basement workspace exactly as it had been, complete with the vintage workbench and tool storage that had been auctioned off. I'd managed to recover some of the original antiques through estate sale dealers who'd purchased them from Hartwell. The process was like an archaeological dig through the antique dealers and collectors who'd bought pieces of my family history. The Tiffany lamps cost me triple what my parents had sold them for, but seeing them illuminate the dining room again made every penny worth it. A collector in Napa Valley had purchased Grandma's complete china set, and when he learned the story behind my search, he sold it back to me at cost and drove it down personally to ensure safe delivery. Other pieces were lost forever, scattered to collectors across the country or even internationally. But I'd found period-appropriate replacements that honored Grandma's aesthetic while creating my own version of her legacy. The new Persian rugs were hand-woven replicas of the originals, and I'd commissioned a furniture maker to recreate the Victorian settee where Grandma and I used to read together every Sunday afternoon. The basement apartment that had never actually existed during my parents' fictional rental story became reality, designed as a comfortable studio with its own entrance through the side garden. My tenants were indeed teachers, a young couple named Maria and James who'd responded to my Craigslist ad with a heartfelt letter about their love of historic homes. They appreciated the house's history, treated it with appropriate reverence, and their rent payments felt like poetic justice, providing the income stream my parents had lied about while they were stealing my inheritance. Maria taught 3rd grade and often worked in the garden with me, learning about the heritage roses and asking questions about Grandma's stories. James taught high school history and was fascinated by the house's connection to the 1920s building boom. They were exactly the kind of tenants Grandma would have chosen, respectful and invested in preserving the property's character. My parents' appeals had been unsuccessful, and they'd served their full prison sentences. Their luxury condo had been seized to pay the restitution, along with their cars, investments, and everything else they'd purchased with my stolen inheritance. The criminal charges had resulted in felony convictions that would follow them for the rest of their lives, making employment and housing difficult even after their release. Dad's health had deteriorated in prison, and Mom had aged dramatically, but I felt no sympathy for their situation. They'd made their choices, and the consequences were entirely of their own making. The extended family members who'd initially supported my parents' version of events had gradually apologized as the truth became undeniable. Aunt Margaret visited the rebuilt house and wept, telling me how proud Grandma would be of what I'd accomplished. "You didn't just get your house back," she said, standing in the kitchen with its restored 1950s checkerboard linoleum. "You got your family's honor back. You proved that good people still fight for what's right, even when it costs them everything." Cousin Danny, who'd initially criticized my lawsuit as an attack on family unity, now brought his children to visit regularly, wanting them to understand the importance of integrity and standing up for principles. I was wrong about everything, he'd admitted during one of his visits. I let them manipulate me into thinking you were the problem when you were the only one telling the truth. The legal victory had attracted media attention, and my story became a cautionary tale about family theft that helped other military families protect their assets while deployed. Elena and I had written a guide for service members about safeguarding inheritances, and several states had strengthened their power of attorney laws as a result of my case. Veterans organizations invited me to speak at legal workshops, and I'd helped 3 other military families recover stolen inheritances through similar insurance policies and legal strategies. The house had been featured in Victorian restoration magazines and architectural journals, but more importantly, it had become a gathering place for the family members who'd remained loyal through the ordeal. Holiday dinners filled the dining room with laughter again, and the garden hosted summer barbecues that would have made Grandma proud. But the real victory wasn't financial or legal. It was the peace I felt sitting in Grandma's garden every evening, watching her rose bushes bloom with the same vibrant colors I remembered from childhood. The house was more than just a building. It was a testament to the power of love, memory, and refusing to give up when people try to steal your dreams. Every sunset I witnessed from the front porch was a reminder that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. Margaret Hoffman, now in her late 70s but still sharp as ever, visited regularly and always brought fresh flowers from her own garden. "Your grandmother knew you had the strongest spirit in the family," she told me during one of her visits. "She used to say you were like the house itself, built to withstand whatever storms came your way. She bet her entire legacy on that strength, and she was right." As I locked the front door each night, I touched the brass nameplate that now read Sarah Morrison in the same elegant script that had once proclaimed Helen Morrison. The house was mine, legally and spiritually, protected by a grandmother's love that had transcended death itself. The war was over, and we had won. 6 months after their release from prison, my parents showed up at my front gate on a cold December morning. They looked broken, aged beyond their years, wearing thrift store clothes and carrying everything they owned in 2 small suitcases. Dad's hands shook as he pressed the intercom button. "Sarah, please," Mom's voice cracked through the speaker. "We have nowhere else to go. We're sorry. We're so sorry." They stood there in the rain, the people who'd once lived in luxury condos while I fought for my country, now homeless and desperate. I looked at them through the window of the house they'd tried to steal, surrounded by the antiques they'd sold in the garden they'd destroyed. For a moment, I felt the old Sarah wanting to help them, to forgive them, to let them in. Instead, I picked up the phone and called the security company. "This is Sarah Morrison at 1247 Elm Street. I have trespassers on my property who are violating their restraining order." As the police car arrived, I realized this was my power reversal moment. They'd once held all the cards, controlling my inheritance while I was powerless overseas. Now I held the power, the house, the money, and the choice. I chose justice over mercy. Some betrayals are simply unforgivable. Grandma Helen would have been proud. We're grateful you stayed with us. For more stories of women reclaiming their voice, click on the left and subscribe to stay connected. May this be a reminder, your story has power too.